He hadn't spoken to the man in years, until a letter arrived with 4 words that shattered everything. Time to come home. Now Keanu Reeves must face the garage, the memories, and the goodbye he's been avoiding before it's too late. What was written inside changed everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The envelope sat alone on the corner of Keanu's desk, resting beside a stack of film scripts he hadn't yet opened. It wasn't glossy or branded, no studio logo, no name typed, just simple paper, aged slightly at the corners, and his name written in shaky cursive. His assistant Nora had found it among the morning mail. No return address, just a smudge of oil on the flap and a faint scent of gasoline and cedar. Keanu stared at it. His name, Keanu Charles Reeves, was written the way only one man ever wrote it. Frank Donovan, the man who raced him. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, a single sheet. The ink was faded, the writing uneven, but it was unmistakably Frank's. No need for speeches. No need for fixing the past. Just one last drive. Keanu didn't move. The letter weighed more than paper ever should. He hadn't seen Frank in nearly 6 years. Their last visit was short. A quiet birthday, shared coffee, a handshake that said too much and not enough. He always told himself he'd go back soon, after the next project, after the next commitment. But now, one last drive. The phrase echoed like an engine starting in the cold. Keanu set the letter down and leaned back in his chair. The room around him blurred as old memories came crashing in. Faded images of Frank's garage, the scent of engine oil and toast, the quiet humming of an old jazz station playing from a dusty radio. He remembered sitting on a stool, barely tall enough to see over the counter, watching Frank change the oil on a neighbor's car. Frank never talked much, but he always noticed, always showed up. Now he was asking Keanu to show up. Keanu stood. He didn't need to ask how Frank had found him. He always did. And he didn't need to know where they were going. He just needed to go. He opened a drawer and pulled out his keys, the same ones Frank had given him when he bought his first beat-up car. The same ring with a little engraved tag that said, "Drive safe and come back." For the first time in years, Keanu canceled everything. He was going home. The flight back to Canada was quiet, but Keanu's thoughts were anything but. As the plane climbed above the clouds, he held the letter in his hands, reading the lines again, over and over. It wasn't just a note. It was a key turning in an emotional ignition he hadn't touched in years. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even his publicist. This wasn't for show. This wasn't a red carpet or a charity gala. This was Frank, the man who taught him how to change a tire before teaching him how to carry himself like a man. The man who stood silently beside him when his father walked out. The man who drove Keanu to his first theater audition in a truck that rattled and coughed, but somehow always made it. Frank never asked for thanks, never needed praise. He fixed things, quietly, thoroughly. He fixed broken engines, he fixed broken moments. And now, Keanu didn't know if he could fix the time he lost. The drive from the airport to his hometown felt like a movie in reverse. Familiar streets with new signs, stores replaced, trees taller. He passed the old ice rink where he used to skate, the corner diner with the same faded awning, and then he saw it. The garage. Frank's garage. The paint was chipped, the sign hung lower than it used to, but it was still there. The wide sliding doors, the cracked sidewalk, the rusted tool rack still visible through the front window. Keanu pulled up and parked. He sat in the car for a long moment before stepping out. The air smelled like pine and oil. The cold bit at his fingers, but the warmth of memory wrapped tighter. He walked slowly toward the front door, half expecting to hear that old jazz station again, drifting through the walls. Instead, it was quiet. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. He was about to knock again when the door creaked open on its own. No lock, no alarm, just trust. Inside, it looked just like it had the last time he saw it, only dustier. The workbench, the faded Polaroids on the wall, the coat rack with Frank's old Navy jacket still hanging. But Frank wasn't there. Keanu stepped inside and whispered, "I'm here." Footsteps echoed lightly from the back room. Then came the familiar shuffle, slow, deliberate. A shape appeared in the doorway. Frank Donovan, thinner than Keanu remembered, shoulders slightly curved, but still solid, still wearing those same dusty work boots and grease-stained flannel. His hair had gone completely white, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides, but his eyes, still steady, still watching everything. Frank didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His face broke into a soft smile, the kind that didn't stretch wide, but settled deep. "You made it," he said, voice rough like gravel but calm like always. "I came," Keanu replied, his voice catching in his throat. They didn't hug. That wasn't Frank's way. Instead, Frank nodded toward the old armchair in the corner, the one Keanu used to nap in after long Saturdays cleaning up the shop. Keanu sat without hesitation. For a few minutes they just existed in silence, the kind of silence that lives between people who understand each other. Then Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. He placed it on the table between them. "It's out back," he said. Keanu glanced at the key, confused. Frank continued, "Figured we'd take one last spin before I stopped driving for good." Keanu's heart ached at the words. This wasn't just a visit. This was a goodbye, wrapped in a gesture so simple, so classically Frank, that it almost hurt more. "You sure you're up for it?" Keanu asked quietly. Frank gave a half shrug. "Might not be fast, might not be far, but it'll be enough." Keanu picked up the key. It felt warm, like it had been in Frank's hand for a while. They rose together. Frank didn't need help walking, but Keanu stayed close anyway. They moved toward the back of the garage, past the old tool racks and into the dim light of the covered carport. There, under a canvas sheet, sat a car that Keanu hadn't seen in over 30 years. A 1973 Dodge Dart, faded blue, dented fender. The same one Frank taught him to drive in. Frank gestured to the driver's side. "You still remember?" Keanu ran his fingers over the hood. Every mile. He unlocked the door, slid inside, and waited as Frank settled into the passenger seat. Then he turned the key. The engine coughed once, then again, and then it roared to life. Their final drive had begun. Keanu sat in his kitchen, the envelope from Frank still resting on the table like a weight no one could lift. He stared at it, unsure what to do next. Then, almost instinctively, he reached for his phone. He hadn't called his mother in a while, not because he didn't love her, but because sometimes the years got too loud. The phone rang once, twice. Then, her voice, soft and warm, just as he remembered. "Keanu? Hey, Mom." There was a pause, the kind where words aren't ready to be said, but the heart already knows. "You got it, didn't you?" Patricia asked. He swallowed hard. "Yeah?" "The letter." She exhaled gently. He didn't want it to be dramatic. You know him. "I know," Keanu said, his voice quieter now. "He's tired," Patricia continued, "but he's still Frank. Still tells the nurses he could fix the wheels on their gurneys better than they can. Still won't let anyone help him brush his hair." Keanu smiled faintly. He could see it. Frank, proud even in hospice, never the kind to complain, never the kind to show pain. "He's staying near the garage?" Keanu asked. "Bill insisted," Patricia said. "Wouldn't hear of being moved far. Says if he's going out, he wants to smell the motor oil one last time." That hit Keanu harder than he expected. "Mom, I should have come sooner." "You still can," she said gently. "He didn't ask for much, Keanu. He never did. But if you're going to go, don't wait too long." There was silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. He still talks about you, Patricia continued. Tells the nurses you were his best student. Says you learned how to fix more than engines. Keanu felt something twist in his chest. Do you think he'll want to see me? He asked. Patricia's voice cracked a little, but she held steady. Honey, he wrote you that letter. That's his way. No big speeches, just one last drive. Keanu looked out the window. The LA sky was bright and empty, but all he could see was the gray of a Toronto winter, the smell of oil, the garage light flickering at dusk. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'm coming home. The next morning, Keanu Reeves stood on the balcony of his home, coffee in hand, sleep barely touching his eyes. The air was crisp for Los Angeles, but his mind wasn't here anymore. It was already back in that small Canadian neighborhood, the one where he first learned how to turn a wrench and steady his hands under pressure. He called his assistant and cleared the next 4 days. No press, no meetings, no obligations. He needed to go not as a movie star, not as a man with global fame, but as a son who had left something unfinished. As he packed a small bag, his eyes fell on an old photograph on the shelf. It was faded from years of sun exposure. Keanu was maybe 12 in the photo, hands dirty with grease, and Frank was standing behind him, arms crossed, grinning like he had just seen the boy fix his first carburetor. Keanu touched the frame. Still tired, huh, old man? He muttered quietly. He tossed the photo into the top of the bag, zipped it shut, and walked out the door. On the flight to Toronto, memories returned like whispered voices. Frank waiting outside school in that dented pickup truck, the one that coughed every time it turned over but never failed to start. Frank teaching him how to check brake fluid with a flashlight, showing him how silence can be louder than any lecture, how kindness didn't need to wear a suit, it just needed to be consistent. Patricia picked him up from the airport. Her hair was grayer now, but her smile hadn't changed. They didn't speak much during the ride to hospice. She drove slow, as if the silence between them carried its own sacred rhythm. At a red light, she said, "He has good days, and he has the ones where you know he's closer to the other side than this one." Keanu nodded. "Is still stubborn? Won't use the wheelchair unless the nurse bribes him with butterscotch pudding," she replied with a sad smile. They pulled into the small lot beside the hospice center. Across the street, the garage still stood, weathered but proud, its faded sign still visible from the window. "Do you think he knows I'm coming?" Patricia looked at him and said, "He's been waiting for that engine to turn over since the day he mailed the letter." Keanu reached for the door handle, his heart pounding like he was walking into a scene he'd rehearsed 100 times, but never quite this way. It was time. The hospice room was small and sunlit, the kind of quiet space Frank Donovan would have appreciated. Nothing flashy, just a soft chair in the corner, a modest bed, and a worn radio on the nightstand, tuned low to some old jazz station. Keanu stepped inside, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. Frank was awake. Barely. His eyes opened just enough to see the figure standing in the doorway. Then, slowly, a crooked smile formed beneath the weathered lines of his face. "You came," he whispered, voice like gravel softened by time. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I came." He stepped forward, unsure of how to greet a man who'd never needed words to make you feel welcome. So he did the one thing Frank always respected. He took a seat and simply stayed. Patricia stood in the doorway, watching the two men, one who had raised, one who had been raised. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just existed in the same air, and somehow that was enough. Frank reached under the blanket and patted something beside him, a set of car keys. Keanu's brows lifted. Frank muttered, "One more drive, kid, one more. You drive, I'll co-pilot." Patricia stepped inside, placing her hand on Frank's shoulder. "He's still got a little gas left in the tank," she said softly, then looked at Keanu. "But not much." Keanu picked up the keys and recognized the keychain instantly. It was the old one, black leather worn smooth from years of pocket rides, the same one from when Frank first let him borrow the truck on a Friday night, all those years ago. He swallowed hard. Frank looked at him, eyes clearer now. "Tomorrow. We'll go tomorrow." Keanu nodded. That night he sat by Frank's bedside, reading aloud from a car magazine they used to flip through together. Frank drifted in and out, but his breathing stayed calm, steady, like the rhythm of a familiar engine, running just fine. When the nurse came in to check vitals, she smiled at Keanu and whispered, "He hasn't slept this peacefully in days." Keanu whispered back, "That makes two of us." The lights dimmed, the jazz hummed low, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel empty, it felt whole. The gravel crunched under the weight of Keanu's black SUV as it rolled slowly into the driveway he hadn't seen in years. The tires settled into the familiar ruts worn by decades of comings and goings. Teenagers on borrowed bikes, neighbors dropping off lawnmowers, and Keanu himself, once barefoot and curious, chasing shade between summers. Now, everything looked smaller, weathered. The siding on the garage had faded to a sun-bleached gray, curling at the edges like old paper. Moss gathered along the lower beams. The roof had a shallow dip in it, but the sign, "Donovan's Garage, Open Doors, Open Hearts," still hung above the door, proud and defiant against time. Keanu turned off the engine but didn't move. His hands rested on the steering wheel, as if anchoring himself to something solid. He stared ahead for a long moment, breathing in the stillness. Wind rustled the maple tree near the porch, the same tree he used to climb as a boy, back when the world was still small enough to understand. His eyes drifted toward the open garage door. The familiar clatter of tools was gone, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against his chest. Then he saw him. Frank Donovan sat in an old recliner just inside the garage, angled toward the sunlight. A fleece blanket covered his legs. His oxygen tank stood like a silent guardian beside him, the narrow plastic tubing running to his nose. Despite the years that had carved deeper lines into his face, Frank still looked composed, strong in that quiet, stubborn way that never left him. He wasn't looking for attention, he wasn't waiting for tears. Frank turned his head slowly and gave a small grunt. "Figured you might be late," he said, voice low but steady. "Still can't change oil worth a damn, can you?" Keanu stepped out of the car, closing the door with care. 100 things rushed to his lips. Apologies, memories, thanks. But none of them felt right. "I thought you'd let the sign fall down," Keanu said instead. Frank shrugged, his mouth twitching with something almost like amusement. "Didn't want folks thinking I'd lost my standards." Keanu walked closer, the distance between them shrinking with every step, but it felt like walking through time. He was home. Keanu stood quietly, taking in the details. The garage was more than a space. It was a museum of memories. Pegboards still held old tools, outlines faded but recognizable. The small radio on the shelf, long silent, once filled the air with classic rock while they worked side by side. On the far wall, an old bulletin board held fading photographs. Him and Frank covered in grease, laughing with neighborhood kids. One picture of his mother, Patricia, holding lemonade under the sun. Frank tapped the side of his recliner with 2 fingers. "Sit. Ain't a throne, but it's earned." Keanu found the old stool near the workbench. It wobbled the same way it always had. He sat. "I got your letter," Keanu said. "Didn't think a text would do it justice." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that isn't awkward, just lived in. Keanu glanced at the oxygen tank, then at Frank's thin frame. The man who once lifted engines like grocery bags now had to summon effort just to shift in his seat. "You should have called sooner," Keanu said gently. Frank's eyes narrowed with that old glint. "And say what? Hey, kid, I'm dying. Get over here? That's not how we do things." Keanu chuckled softly, still stubborn. "Still sensitive," Frank replied with a wink. Another silence settled between them, but this time it was heavier. It held the weight of years past, calls missed, time spent elsewhere. Yet it didn't accuse. It just existed, like rust on old metal. Evidence of use, not failure. "You kept the place," Keanu said, gesturing around them, "even after everyone moved on." Frank nodded slowly. "This place raised more boys than I can count. Taught them to fix more than cars, taught them how to fix themselves. And me?" Frank looked him square in the eye. "You were the first." Keanu's throat tightened. He looked down, pretending to adjust his sleeve. Frank shifted slightly. "So, what do you say we take one last spin? I'm not good for much now, but I can still ride shotgun. If the old girl still runs, that is." Keanu blinked. "You mean the truck?" Frank gave him a look. "You think I wrote that letter for small talk?" Keanu rose slowly. "Let me check under the hood." Frank smirked. "Don't strip the bolts this time." Keanu stepped outside and crossed the driveway toward the side of the garage where the old truck had sat for decades. Covered now with a faded tarp and speckled with leaves, it looked like a forgotten relic from another lifetime. He pulled the tarp back carefully, dust lifting into the light like smoke. And there it was, the 1972 Chevy pickup. Olive green, slight dent in the passenger door, same cracked steering wheel, same hood ornament he used to polish while Frank handed him rags and told stories about Vietnam and life and people who meant what they said. It wasn't just a truck, it was a classroom on wheels, a confessional booth, a temple. Keanu opened the hood. The engine sat like an old soldier, scarred, dependable. He smiled at the familiar layout. It didn't matter how many movie sets he'd been on, how many black cars he'd been chauffeured in, this engine was the first machine he ever touched with intention. Frank had stood behind him, hand guiding his wrist, whispering, "Don't force it, feel it." He checked the oil, still golden. Battery connection looked clean. He tapped the carburetor, tightened a clamp, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. The whole truck shook slightly, as if waking from a long nap. Back in the garage, Frank sat up straighter at the sound. "Well, I'll be damned." Keanu came around to the passenger side and opened the door. "You still fit?" Frank waved him off. "Just give me a minute." It took effort, but Frank rose from the recliner and slowly, steadily made his way to the truck. Keanu helped him into the seat, careful not to rush. It was a sacred kind of slowness. Every movement mattered. Once buckled in, Frank looked around the cab like he was seeing an old friend. "Still smells like motor oil and sandwich wrappers." Keanu laughed. "You used to say that was the smell of home." "It still is." They sat there a moment, engine humming, time folding in on itself. Keanu looked over at the man who had never called himself Dad, but who had done everything a father should do. Steady, quiet, constant. "No speeches," Frank reminded him. Keanu nodded. "Just one last drive." And with that, he shifted into gear, eased the truck out of the driveway, and pointed it toward the winding back roads they hadn't seen in years. The journey had begun. The sun hung low as Keanu helped Frank into the passenger seat of the old restored truck, the one they'd worked on together decades ago, back when Frank's knuckles were stronger and his beard wasn't streaked with gray. Keanu didn't say much. He just helped him in, gently pulled the seatbelt across his chest and clicked it in place. Frank gave a tired nod and tapped the dashboard with the side of his fist. "She still runs?" he asked, eyes scanning the worn leather wheel and faint cracks in the dash. Keanu smiled. "Rebuilt it last year. Kept the same knobs, same radio." Frank chuckled softly. "You're sentimental like your mom." The engine rumbled to life, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Just the sound of gravel under the tires as they rolled slowly down the driveway. It wasn't just a road, it was the space between then and now. Keanu drove slowly through the back streets of their old neighborhood, past houses that hadn't changed and corner stores that had. Frank stared out the window, eyes soft. "That was Mrs. Donnelly's place," Frank said, pointing. Remember when you broke her window with that hockey puck? Keanu laughed. You made me mow her lawn for a month. Frank shook his head, grinning. You never complained, just asked if you could bring lemonade next time. As the truck rolled on, they passed the old elementary school, then the field where Keanu used to race his bike. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was full, weighted with years and words unspoken. There were no dramatic apologies, no last-minute confessions, just presence. That was always Frank's way. Show up, don't explain. Keanu glanced at him as they reached the outskirts of town. You tired? Frank shifted a little. No, not yet. They drove on, the road stretching ahead like a reel of memories. Each turn seemed to unlock another piece of the past. You remember when you first took the wheel? Frank asked, voice barely above the hum of the tires. Keanu nodded. 10 years old. You let me steer while you worked the pedals. You almost ran us into the fence, Frank said, smiling faintly. But you held on. You always held on. That line stayed with Keanu longer than he expected. The road curved through a cluster of tall pines, where the shade fell in soft strips across the windshield. Keanu rolled the window down halfway, letting the scent of old leaves and earth drift in. Frank tilted his head toward the breeze, closing his eyes like he was trying to memorize the air. Your mom used to drive this stretch like it was the Indy 500, he muttered. Always 5 minutes late, always with curlers still in her hair. Keanu laughed. She still drives like that? Frank smirked, then coughed once into his sleeve. The sound lingered, a reminder. Keanu gripped the wheel tighter. He wanted to pull time backward, to take this drive in reverse, to stall the inevitable. I should have come sooner, he said quietly. Frank didn't answer right away. Then, you came. That's enough. They passed a weathered barn, the kind that looked like it had stories trapped in the rafters. Frank motioned toward it. That's where you gave your first speech. Keanu blinked. What? You were maybe 7. Some neighbor kid was getting bullied. You stood on a crate and told him off. Said everyone deserved to be left alone when they were quiet. Keanu hadn't remembered that. I just saw a boy being hurt. That's all it ever takes, Frank said, seeing it. Doing something. The truck slowed as they approached a gravel turnout with a wide view of a frozen pond. Frank raised his hand. Here, pull over. Keanu parked. They sat in silence for a while, watching wind ripple across the ice. Frank tapped the window glass gently with his finger. This was our spot after that awful parent-teacher night, remember? Keanu smiled. Yeah, I failed math, and you brought me here instead of lecturing me. You were scared to tell your mom? I thought she'd cry. Frank nodded slowly. She didn't cry, but I remember what you said. Keanu turned. What did I say? You said you didn't want to disappoint me. Frank's voice cracked, just once. I never told you enough. You didn't. Keanu swallowed hard. I know. Frank leaned back in the seat and looked out again. I wasn't always sure if I was doing it right, being there for you. But you turned out okay. Keanu rested a hand over Frank's. I turned out because of you. The sky turned golden as the light shifted. Stillness settled between them again, but this time it felt like peace. The wind picked up slightly as Frank opened the glove compartment. Inside, folded with care, was a map, creased and worn from years of handling. He laid it on his lap, smoothing it out with a hand that shook just a little. I used to mark the places we talked about visiting, you remember? Keanu leaned over. There were small red dots scattered across the map, some with faded pencil notes. Route 66, the Blue Ridge Parkway, Jasper National Park. Frank nodded. You used to say we'd take the long road, hit every diner with a jukebox. Keanu smiled, his voice quiet. We always ran out of time. Frank traced one dot near the border. That's where your mom said yes to dinner. That was the beginning of everything. Keanu glanced over. Why didn't you ever marry her? Frank looked down at the map, folding it slowly. She didn't need a husband. She needed stability. I wasn't always sure I could be that, but I could be present. I could be consistent. He looked at Keanu now, and for you, I just wanted to be the man I wish I'd had. Keanu swallowed hard. You were. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy, it was full. Like every word that mattered had already been said. Frank finally tapped the dashboard. All right, turn us around. Let's head back before I fall asleep and start snoring. Keanu started the engine, easing the truck back onto the road. As they drove, Frank rested his hand on the passenger door, watching the trees pass in slow motion. His eyelids dipped, but he stayed awake. Can I tell you something? Frank asked softly. Of course. That night you left for Hollywood, I sat in the garage for 3 hours, just listening to the ticking of the tools. I didn't know if I'd see you again, but I knew I'd already seen the best part of my life. Keanu's throat tightened. I should have told you more. You didn't have to. You showed up. That's what matters. As the road curved toward home, the sky behind them glowed with the deep colors of dusk. It felt like a sunset on more than just the day. But Keanu didn't let the moment slip away in sadness. He reached over and placed his hand gently on Frank's shoulder. Let's make this last stretch count. And they drove on, quiet, together, like they always did. The road out of town was nearly empty as Keanu turned onto the long stretch of asphalt that used to lead them to the old junkyard. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the occasional bird darted across the windshield. In the passenger seat, Frank adjusted his seatbelt slowly, wincing slightly as he moved. For a few miles, neither of them spoke. Keanu's mind wandered, then anchored itself on a single memory, crisp as if it had happened yesterday. He was 10, maybe 11. His hands too small for the wrench, his arms too weak to loosen the rusted bolt on the side of a battered lawnmower Frank had picked up from a neighbor. He remembered the sting of failure, the way his eyes had started to well up before he turned away to hide it. Frank, he said gently, breaking the silence. Do you remember that old green lawnmower that didn't want to be fixed? Frank grunted. I remember the bolt that nearly broke your spirit. Keanu laughed under his breath. You told me not to fight the rust, to work with it. Frank tilted his head slightly, lips curling into the smallest smile. Because fighting it just strips the thread. But if you work with it, even the old stuff loosens eventually. I think that was your first real lesson to me, Keanu said softly. Frank's hand rested briefly on the dash. Funny, I thought the lesson was that you were stubborn. No, Keanu smiled. The lesson was patience. You always had a way of teaching it without ever using the word. Frank chuckled dryly, and here I thought I was just trying to get that old mower running. As they continued driving, the sun slipped in and out of the clouds. The world outside moved on, but inside the car, time seemed to fold in on itself. It wasn't just a ride anymore. It was a return to every memory built between busted transmissions, oil-stained shirts, and late-night drives after arguments that didn't need fixing. Just presence. Frank turned slightly to look at him. You might have made it big in Hollywood, but let's be honest, you still don't know how to rotate tires. Keanu grinned. That's fair, but I can quote every lesson you gave me under the hood. And for the first time that day, Frank laughed. Really laughed. It sounded like gravel and warmth. They passed a roadside diner, long abandoned, the paint peeling off the wooden sign and one shutter hanging by a nail. Keanu glanced at it, smiling. You remember when I thought that place was haunted? Frank gave a slow nod. You wouldn't go in for fries unless I carried you. I was 8, Keanu defended. You were 13, Frank shot back with a sly grin. Keanu let out a breath of laughter, the sound pulling the years backward. He glanced at Frank, whose hands, once firm and thick with grease, now trembled lightly in his lap. But his presence hadn't changed. He was still solid. Still Frank. A moment passed before Frank cleared his throat. You know, I didn't think I was doing anything special back then. Just teaching you to use a torque wrench, fix a loose chain, put some order in the chaos. But it wasn't about the machines, Keanu said, his voice low. It was about learning how to stay steady when life stripped your bolts. Frank looked out the window, quiet again. The hum of the road filled the silence. Then Frank spoke. I never had a son of my own. Didn't think I was built for it. But you, he trailed off, you made me wish I'd started sooner. Keanu gripped the wheel a little tighter. The road curved gently, but his chest felt like it turned harder. I never said thank you, Keanu admitted. Not really. Not enough. Frank shifted slightly. Didn't raise you for a thank you. Just wanted to make sure you had tools I didn't. Keanu glanced at him. You gave me more than tools. A short pause. You gave me someone to look up to when I had no one else to look around at. Frank didn't respond right away, but he nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Well, he said gruffly, that explains why you're still bad at oil changes, too busy being poetic. Keanu laughed, wiping at his eye with the back of his wrist. Can't help it. You taught me how to loosen bolts, but you also taught me how to open my heart. And for a long stretch of road, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The drive continued in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the half-cracked window. Keanu reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded map, creased and faded, with grease marks smudged across the edges. Frank noticed and gave a soft laugh. Didn't think you still had that old thing. Keanu laid it across the dashboard. You circled every scenic route, every little diner, every junkyard that had something worth fixing. I never threw it out. Frank nodded slowly. It wasn't about the stops. It was about keeping you moving. They passed a gas station with an old payphone out front, a relic from another time. Frank nodded toward it. That's where you called your first casting director, collect call. Thought you were in trouble. Keanu smiled at the memory. You didn't ask why, you just said, go get it, kid. Frank adjusted in his seat, wincing slightly. Didn't need to know why. I saw the fire. Just needed to keep your tank full. The car rolled on, tires humming like a lullaby between memories. Keanu looked over again. You know, I used to think real strength was loud, commanding, assertive. And now? Frank asked. Now I know it's quiet. It's in the man who shows up, every day, even when no one's looking. Frank turned his head, meeting Keanu's gaze. That's the lesson I hoped you'd learn. You can make noise, sure, but you build things in the silence. They pulled off onto a gravel turnout overlooking a wide meadow bathed in golden light. Keanu parked the car, turned off the engine, and let the stillness settle. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal bolt, rusted and worn. He handed it to Keanu. That's from the first engine we rebuilt. You couldn't get it loose, remember? You yelled, cursed, almost threw the wrench. Keanu took the bolt in his palm, smiling. I told you not to fight the rust, Frank said. Told you to work with it. Keanu looked at him, eyes misting. I remember. I didn't get it then. I do now. Frank leaned back in the seat, eyes closing for a moment. Then I did my job. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that mattered. The road stretched quiet and familiar as they pulled off onto a dusty side street just outside a fading town. Keanu eased the old truck into a parking spot in front of the small roadside diner. The neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window, flickering in the daylight. It looked almost the same as it had 30 years ago. Maybe the paint was more chipped, maybe the sign leaned a little more to the right, but the soul of it hadn't changed. Frank exhaled slowly as Keanu turned off the engine. Still smells like burnt toast from here, he said with a grin, his voice thin but amused. Keanu chuckled. Some things never change. Inside, the diner was quiet. A single fan spun lazily on the ceiling, and a soft country tune hummed from an old radio behind the counter. A waitress in her 50s stood up from a stool near the register, blinking in recognition as they stepped through the door. "Wait a second," she said, squinting. "Are you?" Keanu raised a hand gently, stopping her before the question finished. "He's the legend today," he said, nodding toward Frank, who stood behind him with a slight wobble, but his usual quiet dignity. Fran smiled, tipping an imaginary hat. "Don't worry, I won't sign autographs either." The waitress laughed and waved them toward a booth near the window. Keanu helped Frank settle in gently, careful of the oxygen tank. When they sat across from each other, silence took over. Not awkward, not forced. Just warm. The waitress brought menus, though neither of them looked. "2 coffees, 1 black, 1 cream, no sugar," Frank said, already knowing what they wanted. The woman gave a knowing smile and walked off without a word. They sat for a moment, taking in the hum of the diner, the clink of mugs, the chatter of distant conversations. Frank pulled a napkin from the dispenser and reached into his coat pocket for a pen. His hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it. "What are you doing?" Keanu asked softly. Frank said nothing at first. He sketched slowly. A crooked heart with a wrench running through the center. He held it up. "That's us," he said, eyes glinting. "All patched up, but still running." Keanu blinked fast. A lump tightened in his throat. "I'll keep that," he whispered. Frank slid it across the table. "You better." The waitress returned with their coffee and placed the mugs on the table with a gentle clink. She glanced at Frank and said, "I used to see you come in here when I was a kid. You always ordered the same thing, chili and toast?" Frank gave a soft laugh. "Back then, it was the only thing I could afford that filled me up." Keanu smiled, resting his hands around his mug. "He used to bring me here after long days at the garage," he said. "He'd let me order anything, even though I always picked the same grilled cheese." Frank nodded. "You'd eat half, wrap the rest in a napkin, and give it to the first stray cat you saw." Keanu looked down at the coffee. "You remember that?" Frank's eyes didn't waver. "I remember everything that mattered." There was a pause, not silence, because the diner had its own music. The scrape of forks, the sizzle of something from the kitchen, the buzz of memories around them. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter Frank had sent, the one that had brought him back. "I didn't know what I'd find," he said. "I thought maybe you were already gone." Frank leaned back slightly. "I almost was, but then I remembered. I promised you a ride." Keanu's breath caught. "You kept that promise? Even now?" Frank stared at the napkin drawing between them. A man's word means more when he's got fewer left to give. They sat in quiet agreement, each holding their cup like it contained more than just coffee. It held years, lessons, regret, gratitude, everything that was never spoken in the chaos of growing up, of fame, of absence. "Where the wrench?" Keanu finally asked, nodding toward the sketch. Frank looked down at it. "Because love isn't delicate. It's not some porcelain statue. It's the thing you grab when life falls apart, the thing that keeps you going. It fixes what's bent, and it holds things together long enough to try again." Keanu looked out the window. The truck sat patiently by the curb, the same way Frank had waited, always close, never pushing. He turned back. "You've always been the wrench, haven't you?" Frank gave the faintest smile. That or a very persistent bolt. They both laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was full. Outside, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Keanu looked down at the napkin once more. He folded it gently, as if it were made of glass. As they rose from the booth, the waitress returned with their bill, but Keanu gently waved it off and placed a folded bill under his coffee mug. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for today, for holding a space like this." The waitress smiled softly, not pressing, just nodding with quiet understanding. She looked at Frank. "Come back any time, okay?" Frank gave a tired nod. "If the wheels don't fall off." Outside, the evening air wrapped around them like a faded blanket. Cool, dry, and still. The truck gleamed under the street lamp, an aging beast of burden that had seen too many miles and carried too many stories. Keanu opened the door for Frank, who climbed in slowly, one careful motion at a time. The effort was visible now. His hands trembled more, his breath shorter, but his pride masked it like armor. Keanu slid behind the wheel and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered once, then rumbled to life, its sound familiar and grounding. As they pulled onto the road, Frank looked out the window and said, "You know, this was the first place I ever thought of bringing your mom. Never did. Didn't think she'd say yes." Keanu glanced over. "Why not?" "I wasn't much to look at back then. Grease-stained shirts, one paycheck away from losing the shop. But I figured, if I kept the place clean, if I fixed things the right way, maybe she'd notice I could do more than turn a wrench." "She noticed," Keanu said gently, "even if she didn't say it out loud." Frank nodded, his gaze still fixed outside. "She saw more than I thought anyone could." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, headlights slicing through the growing darkness. The landscape rolled by, familiar turns, old signs, a gas station that hadn't changed in decades. "Frank," Keanu said, breaking the quiet, "what was that sketch really about? The heart and the wrench?" Frank turned his head slowly. "It means you don't have to be whole to be strong. You can be patched, rusted, dinged to hell, and still, you move forward." Keanu exhaled, a quiet breath of understanding. No spotlight, no final speech. Just a napkin drawing and a ride home in an old truck. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like a boy again, next to the man who never tried to be a father, but somehow became the only one who ever was. The sun began its slow descent behind the trees as the truck rumbled along the empty country road. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the smell of early spring, damp earth, new buds, and the faint trace of engine oil that lingered on the sleeves of Frank's jacket. They hadn't said much since the diner. The silence wasn't awkward, it was loaded. Keanu gripped the steering wheel with both hands, stealing glances at Frank, whose eyes were fixed on the passing fields like they were old friends. There was a gravity in the air, one neither of them could dodge much longer. Frank broke it first. "I watched your first premiere on a TV the size of a lunchbox," he said, his voice rough but steady. "In a bar. Bunch of truckers thought you were a punk. I told them, that punk's the best man I ever taught how to hold a wrench." Keanu swallowed the sudden lump in his throat. "I should have invited you," he said quietly. Frank waved a hand. "Nah, wouldn't have gone." There was a pause. And then, "But I wouldn't have minded being asked." That one landed hard. Keanu's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. "I got caught up," he admitted. "The rolls, the travel, everything moved so fast, and I figured you'd understand." "I did," Frank nodded. "Still do. But there's a difference between understanding something and not feeling it." They drove in silence again for a moment. Then Frank continued, softer this time. "Birthdays came and went, you missed a few, but I always got a postcard. That was enough most days. Other days," he chuckled faintly, "other days I'd yell at the TV, 'That boy can save the world in a movie, but can't call his old man on.'" Keanu chuckled too, but there was pain behind it. I didn't mean to disappear," he said. "I just didn't know how to come back." Frank turned to look at him. "You didn't disappear, son, you just drifted. And now you're here. That's the thing, you came back." They pulled off the road and parked beneath a canopy of old pine trees. Frank reached across and placed a hand over Keanu's. "Let's not waste this ride on regrets." Keanu nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Frank slowly opened the glove box and pulled out a small, leather-bound notepad. The edges were frayed, its pages yellowed. Keanu watched as Frank flipped it open to a bookmarked page and handed it to him. "What's this?" Keanu asked. Frank gave a small shrug. "Things I meant to say, stuff I never found the moment for. Some days I'd sit in the garage and scribble. Didn't think you'd ever read it. Didn't think I'd need you to." Keanu flipped to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, blocky, a little crooked, and deeply familiar. Keanu learned how to patch a tire today. He got more grease on his face than the car, but he smiled like he built the whole thing himself. That smile, I'd give anything to keep it on him forever. Keanu blinked rapidly and turned the page. Keanu's first play. I told him I couldn't make it. Didn't want to distract him. Truth is, I sat in the back. Didn't want him to see me crying. Keanu closed the book gently, placing it on the dashboard as if it were sacred. I didn't know, he said. I didn't want you to, Frank replied. That book wasn't for guilt. It was for me, to remember I had a hand in something good. Keanu reached across and squeezed Frank's hand, firm and steady. You had more than a hand. You were the reason. Frank looked out the window, his jaw clenched. You remember that summer your mom got pneumonia and I started working doubles? Keanu nodded slowly. I missed your school trip, Frank continued. You came home with that silly tourist hat and didn't say a word. But I saw it in your face. You were waiting for me to show up. I remember, Keanu whispered. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I chose work. Chose keeping the lights on. You chose survival, Keanu said. And because of you, I never went to bed hungry. I never felt unsafe. Frank smiled faintly. Still, I wish I'd found a way to do both. They sat for a moment, two grown men surrounded by time and silence, both reaching across years of misunderstanding with something more powerful than apology. Understanding. Funny thing, Frank said after a pause. You spend your whole life thinking the world owes you a moment. Then you grow up and realize the moment you really needed was always waiting on you to come back. Keanu nodded, quietly overwhelmed. Frank shifted in his seat, wincing a little as the oxygen tube tugged gently. Keanu noticed and adjusted it without a word. The gesture wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Frank gave him a grateful nod. You know, Frank murmured, I didn't teach you everything I meant to. You taught me enough, Keanu replied. Frank smiled faintly. Still, there were things I hoped you'd ask me someday. Like what? Frank looked toward the windshield, his voice thinner but steady. How I got the scar on my forearm, or why I stopped playing music, why I never remarried. Keanu looked over at him. Why didn't you? Frank chuckled. Because I didn't need more. Your mom, you, that was the family I never asked for but was lucky enough to have. Keanu stared out at the road. I should have told you this years ago, but I was afraid. Of what? That if I said it out loud, I'd lose something. Like putting words to it would break the spell. Frank turned, locking eyes with him. And now? Keanu swallowed hard. Now I just want to say it. You were the best father I could have had. You didn't have to be, but you were. Frank didn't cry. He didn't need to. His hand rested on Keanu's shoulder, strong despite everything time had taken. I know, he said. The hum of the car filled the space between them. The past didn't need fixing. It had just needed a place to breathe. As the road stretched ahead, Frank closed his eyes for a moment, the sun warming his face through the window. Keanu drove on, quieter now, the guilt in his chest easing, not because it had vanished, but because it had finally been heard. Sometimes healing didn't come from grand gestures. Sometimes it came from being willing to sit in silence with someone who knew the same pain. As they pulled into a scenic overlook, Keanu parked the car and looked over. Frank was already asleep, his hand still resting lightly on the notebook between them. Keanu didn't wake him. He just sat there, grateful for every missed year that still gave way to this moment, for the man who stayed, even when life moved too fast to see him, the shadow beside his own, and for the silence that somehow said everything. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood polish, just like it always had. Keanu stepped through the front door and took a slow breath, letting it settle in his chest. Frank moved more slowly behind him, guided by his oxygen tank and the gentle grip Keanu offered on his arm. Patricia appeared in the hallway, Her hair streaked with silver now, but her eyes still sharp, still full of knowing. She didn't rush to hug them. She just looked between them, gave a soft smile, and said, "Come to the kitchen. I've got something for you." The three of them sat at the table where so many meals had been shared. Keanu's eyes flicked to the empty mug hooks, the faded placemats, the chipped clock above the stove that still worked, only slower now. Patricia left for a moment and returned holding a large, dusty album. She placed it on the table like it weighed more than it did, and when she opened it, the first photo took Keanu's breath. It was him, maybe 9 years old, slumped asleep on Frank's lap in the back seat of their old Buick. His school play had ended late that night, and he remembered being too tired to talk. Frank had just patted his shoulder and said, "Rest, you earned it." Keanu didn't remember the photo being taken, but there it was. Frank wasn't smiling in the picture. He was just looking down at Keanu with a kind of quiet pride that spoke louder than words. Patricia turned the page. More memories. A shot of Frank teaching Keanu how to measure tire pressure in the garage. Another of the three of them at a 4th of July picnic, a rare day when Frank actually let someone take his photo. Keanu swallowed hard, looking at his younger self and the man who had never tried to fill the title of dad, but had done everything a father would. "Hell never missed a play," Patricia said, her voice low but clear. "Never missed a sick day, never raised his voice. And when we didn't have enough for the field trip to Quebec, he sold his fishing gear. Just told you he didn't use it anymore." Frank said nothing. He didn't have to. The moment was full, complete, sacred in its simplicity. Keanu blinked back tears. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Patricia smiled. "Because he wasn't trying to be remembered. He was just trying to be there." Keanu turned the pages slowly, each photo a trigger for some half-buried memory. A Halloween costume made from a cardboard box and duct tape. A science fair project. An exploding volcano that barely worked. A picture of Frank holding a flashlight while Keanu worked on something under the sink. His hand steady, his eyes patient. "It wasn't always easy," Patricia said softly, resting her hand on the album's edge. "You were a handful, and Frank, he didn't always know what to say. But he never left, never walked away. You'd come home from school, angry or quiet or just worn out, and he'd already be in the garage. Like he knew." Frank gave a soft grunt that could have meant anything, but Keanu looked at him and smiled. "You didn't miss much, huh?" Frank didn't answer with words. He just tapped the table twice with his knuckles, like he'd done since Keanu was a kid. His version of, "You're good." Patricia closed the album gently and pushed it toward Keanu. "I want you to keep this." Keanu shook his head. "It belongs here." "No," she said. "It was always meant for you. I just waited until the right moment." Frank looked at Patricia, then at Keanu, and his lips twitched up in the barest trace of a smile. He wasn't one for grand gestures, but his eyes, those calm mechanic's eyes, held something that made Keanu feel like a boy again. Patricia stood and walked to the drawer near the fridge. She pulled something else out, an old shoebox, tied shut with a worn piece of twine. She placed it beside the album. "I found this last week," she said. He'd been putting things in here over the years. Keanu untied the box slowly and lifted the lid. Inside were small, strange keepsakes. A matchbox car with chipped paint, a rusty wrench with Keanu's initials scratched into the handle, a note he'd written at 12, "I want to be a hero like Frank," and a photo, faded now, of Keanu at 15, beaming in a high school hallway, Frank standing off to the side, arms folded but proud. Keanu sat in silence, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what to say. Patricia sat back down, her hand brushing his shoulder. "You always thought you were chasing something out there," she whispered. "But Frank? He just wanted you to see what was already here." Keanu closed the shoebox gently, but his hands lingered on the lid. He looked across the room to where Frank sat in his chair, arms crossed, legs slightly stretched. the familiar weight of years tucked into every wrinkle of his clothes. He wasn't asleep, just quiet. "You kept all of this," Keanu said, his voice low. Frank nodded once, eyes fixed ahead. Didn't know why at the time, just felt right to hang on to pieces of things. Patricia smiled and walked to the kitchen to start tea, leaving the two men in a comfortable hush. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on the table, and picked up the photo of him at 15 again. He remembered that day. He hadn't realized Frank had come to the school play. He hadn't seen him in the crowd. Hadn't known he was watching from the back. "You were always there," Keanu said, glancing over. "Yeah," Frank replied. "Not always close, but never far." That single sentence hit deeper than any monologue Keanu had ever performed. Because it was true. Frank hadn't tried to be a replacement father. He hadn't pushed his way in. He had just stayed, quietly, consistently. And in doing so, he'd carved out a space no one else had ever filled. Patricia returned with 2 cups, placing one in front of each man. She sat across from them, sipping hers carefully, eyes soft. "You know," she said, "Frank was the first man who never asked me to be less." Keanu looked up. Al didn't expect perfection. He didn't run when I was tired or when I broke down. He just stayed. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Frank cleared his throat, and Keanu thought for a moment he might speak. But instead, he reached for his cup and took a long sip. Then he smiled. A small one, but real. Keanu laughed gently. "You're still the same, huh?" Frank shrugged. "Changing takes too much effort." They all chuckled, the sound drifting into the quiet of the house, and for a while, that was enough. Later, as the sun dipped low, Keanu stood in the doorway with the photo album under his arm and the shoebox in his hands. Frank raised a hand from his chair, just a small wave, and Keanu mirrored it. That evening, Keanu would sit alone in his old room, flipping through the photos one by one, holding pieces of a man who never said much, but somehow said everything that mattered. The morning was still, the air tinged with sawdust and the distant scent of oil long settled into the walls. Keanu stood in the center of the old garage, his eyes adjusting to the half-light filtering in through the dusty windows. It was a familiar place, one that had raised him in ways he didn't fully appreciate until now. Frank sat in his usual chair, an old recliner patched with duct tape and time. A thin oxygen tube trailed across the floor, weaving past a pile of stacked tires and an unopened box of spark plugs that hadn't moved in years. His blanket, gray and worn, was pulled over his lap, but his hands rested free, calloused and cracked, as if even now they were still waiting to be put to work. Keanu looked around at the walls covered in old license plates, faded Polaroids, and yellowed newspaper clippings. There were snapshots of neighborhood kids holding wrenches, greasy hands, and bright smiles, himself included, maybe 12 or 13, frozen in a moment when he still thought the world was small enough to fix with the right tool. Frank pointed slowly to the garage door. "It's sticking again," he said. His voice was soft, but there was steel in it. "Bottom hinge, left side." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You really want to do this now?" Frank didn't answer right away. He just gave a faint smirk. If a man leaves a broken door behind, what's the last thing people hear? A slam. I'd rather leave it smooth. Without another word, Keanu walked to the tool bench and opened the red metal toolbox. The familiar creak made his chest tighten. He remembered every drawer, every scratch on the surface. It was like opening a time capsule he'd buried in his heart. He picked up the wrench, an old one, the handle wrapped in black electrical tape from a repair decades ago. He paused, ran his thumb along the tape's edge. It was the same wrench Frank had handed him the first time he taught Keanu how to change a tire. Turning, he walked the wrench over and placed it in Frank's waiting hand. For a second, their fingers brushed. Rough and steady, a language without words. Frank gave a small nod. let's go fix it." Keanu crouched beside the hinge. Frank rolled forward in the chair he'd insisted on keeping mobile. Keanu held the bolt steady, and with trembling fingers, Frank began to turn the wrench. Slowly, carefully, like he was tuning something sacred. The metal groaned, but it moved. One click at a time, they worked in rhythm, like old times, like father and son. Keanu held the panel steady as Frank tightened the final bolt. The wrench slipped a little. His strength wasn't what it used to be, but Keanu didn't move. He waited, patient, just like Frank had taught him all those years ago. After a few more turns, Frank let out a slow breath. That should do it. Keanu tested the door. This time the hinges groaned softly, but the motion was smooth, no jarring slam, just a quiet, graceful slide open, as if the garage itself was sighing in relief. Frank leaned back, watching it close again with a calm satisfaction. "Not perfect," he muttered, "but it'll hold." Keanu stood beside him, silent. For a while, neither spoke. The morning light streamed in now, cutting across the garage floor and falling gently over the two of them. Dust floated like memories in the sunbeam. "You know," Frank said, rubbing his fingers together slowly, "I always figured my last fix would be alone. Just me, a creaky wrench, and some rust I'd curse under my breath. I didn't expect this." Keanu glanced over. Neither did I. Frank's eyes studied the garage. "It ain't much. Some guys leave buildings with their names on them, fortune, foundations. I left this," he shrugged. "A patchwork roof, a bucket of bolts, a cracked radio that only gets blues." Keanu knelt beside him. "You left more than that." Frank gave a skeptical look, but Keanu didn't back down. "You left me with something I couldn't have gotten from any set, or stage, or contract. You taught me that showing up matters, that real strength doesn't shout, it just does the work. Every part of who I am, it started here." Frank blinked. His voice was quiet now, almost like he was speaking to the bolts and beams around them. "I never asked to be your father." "I know," Keanu replied, "but you showed up anyway. That's what made you one." Frank stared at the hinge. Funny thing about a garage. It creaks when it opens, smells like oil, and never gets any awards. But it's where things get fixed, where people learn. Keanu smiled faintly. "It's where I learned everything that mattered." Frank chuckled, low and scratchy. "And you still don't know how to rotate tires." Keanu laughed through the tightness in his throat. "Guess some lessons take a lifetime." Frank looked at him, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Good thing I stuck around." The light had shifted by the time they finished, turning golden and long, stretching shadows across the floor. Frank's breathing had grown slower, not labored, just steady and deep, like a man who had earned his rest. He reached for the folded shop towel on the workbench and wiped his hands slowly, with care. It was a ritual, almost sacred. Keanu stood nearby, not moving. He wanted to say something, something profound, something lasting, but nothing came. All the lines he'd ever memorized for the screen couldn't touch this silence. Frank was right. Some things were better left in the doing, not the saying. Then Frank spoke, his voice softer now. "When your mom first brought you here, you were what? 9? Scrawny, quiet, always looking around like you were expecting to be left again?" Keanu swallowed hard. "I didn't plan on staying, you know. I told Patricia I'd fix the car and go. But then, you handed me that old flashlight, like it meant something, and you smiled, like I was already part of the picture." "You were," Keanu said. Frank nodded, eyes glossy but unblinking. "I knew then I wouldn't go." He motioned toward the garage door with his chin. "Leave it open." Keanu hesitated. "Why?" "So, I can still hear the wind roll through when I nap." Keanu smiled, but it was weak, too many emotions pressed at his chest. Frank tapped the bench. "Check that drawer, far left." Keanu opened it. Inside was a small, time-worn envelope with his name written in Frank's slanted, deliberate handwriting. "Not for today," Frank said. "For the day you don't know what to say and need someone to say it for you." Keanu closed the drawer gently. "Thank you." Frank leaned back in the chair, watching the sun reach the far wall. "One last fix," he whispered. "That's all any of us ever get." Keanu stepped to his side, not speaking, just resting a hand on Frank's shoulder. It stayed there, steady, warm, the same way Frank's had rested on his when he first picked up a wrench all those years ago. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves, the garage door creaked slightly, and in the soft rhythm of light and dust and memory, Keanu knew. This wasn't the end. It was the closing of a chapter written in oil, silence, and unwavering love. And Frank Donovan, quiet mechanic, Vietnam vet, unsung father, had just finished his finest repair. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in before a goodbye. Outside the garage, the sky was pale with spring haze. Frank leaned gently against the passenger door of the old truck, its weathered paint kissed by light. Keanu opened the driver's side and climbed in. It still smelled faintly of oil and pine air freshener, just like it had decades ago. As Keanu reached to adjust the seat, his hand brushed against the glove box. Something nudged loose, hidden behind the usual stack of registration papers and faded receipts. He paused. There, tucked just out of sight, was a small leather notebook. Brown, cracked, and soft at the edges. The kind of notebook that had lived a long life in a man's pocket. He opened it. The pages were filled with Frank's handwriting. Meticulous, mechanical, a bit crooked. The first page simply read, "To the kid who never stopped fixing what mattered." Keanu felt his chest tighten. He flipped gently through the notebook, each page marked with a single thought, quote, or lesson. Some were deeply philosophical, others were pure Frank. "If you don't know what's broken, stop hitting it. Grease under your nails means you did something worth doing. Kindness is a tool, use it daily." One entry stopped him cold, written in slightly larger print than the rest. "Keanu, don't forget where you learned to hold steady." His breath caught. For a moment, he didn't know if he wanted to cry or smile. That sentence, so simple, so perfectly Frank, spoke louder than any eulogy ever could. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a handoff. Keanu turned to look at Frank through the windshield. Frank was watching him from the porch, arms crossed, gently. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just looked. Because he knew. Keanu tucked the notebook into his coat pocket, not just for safekeeping, but because something about it needed to be near his heart. This wasn't about tools or trucks or garages anymore. This was about legacy. And Frank, in the quietest way possible, had just passed it down. Keanu closed the glove box gently, almost reverently. The silence in the truck felt different now. Less empty, more alive. That little notebook had weight, but not just physical. It carried history, memory, and something more powerful than both: intention. He ran his fingers across the leather cover again. Each scuff told a story. Rides to school, late nights fixing the alternator, silent trips home after hard days. That notebook had sat there through it all, absorbing years like oil into cloth. Frank never said much about being a father, but this was his way. Keanu turned the key. The engine coughed once, then rumbled to life. He let it idle, the soft purr steadying his breath. Then he reached over and opened the notebook again. About halfway through, pressed between two handwritten notes, was something unexpected. A folded photograph. It was old, sun-bleached, edges curling inward. He opened it carefully. There they were, Frank in a grease-stained shirt, leaning against the truck. A much younger Keanu beside him, maybe 15, holding up a spark plug like it was a trophy. The smile on Frank's face wasn't big, but it was real. full of pride, quiet and present, just like he always was. Keanu turned it over. A date was scribbled on the back, June 1981, and beneath it, first time he got it running. That memory came rushing back. The heat of that summer day, the stubborn engine, Frank stepping back as Keanu turned the wrench and twisted the bolt. And then, ignition. The way Frank hadn't said good job but instead had walked over, clapped him once on the shoulder and simply said, "You'll do." It was the kind of approval that didn't need a spotlight, the kind that lasted. The next page in the notebook carried only one sentence. "You don't raise a boy with noise. You raise him with steadiness." Keanu sat back, resting the notebook on his lap. For a long time, he had tried to put into words what Frank meant to him, but the words always fell short. Reading this now, he realized Frank had written the words for him over a lifetime of showing up. And maybe that was the final lesson. Fathers don't always say what you need to hear. Sometimes they leave it in the glove box and trust you'll find it when you're ready. Keanu sat in the driver's seat for what felt like an hour, though time had gone soft since he arrived. Outside, the trees swayed in slow rhythm, the last rays of afternoon sun catching the rust-lined corners of the garage. He closed the notebook and rested it on the dash. Then he reached for the radio dial, not sure why. Static flickered, then the hum of an old station came through, something gentle, timeless. A voice crooning about the road and home. Frank would have liked that. Keanu looked at the seat beside him, empty, but somehow not lonely. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pen from the inner pocket, Frank's old mechanic pen, the one with the faded red grip. He opened to the back page of the notebook and, in neat, steady letters, wrote, "You taught me more than how to fix things. You taught me how to hold on, how to let go, and how to drive through the quiet." He paused, then added, "Love you, old man, always did, even when I didn't say it." He slid the notebook back into the glove box and clicked it shut. Then he stepped out of the truck, stretched his legs, and turned toward the house. Frank was probably asleep by now, but Keanu would sit with him anyway. Maybe just hold his hand, maybe read to him from the notebook, maybe say nothing at all. But he'd be there. Before heading in, he took one last glance at the truck. Its worn tires, its scarred hood, the little cracks in the windshield from years gone by. It wasn't beautiful in the usual way, but it was honest, sturdy. It had taken him where he needed to go, and it still could, just like Frank. Keanu reached into his back pocket, pulled out the truck keys, and looked at them. Then he smiled. He didn't need to go anywhere right now. Everything he'd been looking for was already parked here, waiting in the glove box, stitched into the silence, written into every turn of the road they'd taken together. Frank had left behind no fame, no headlines, just something far better. A map made of memories, and a legacy that fit in the palm of your hand. The pickup moved gently over the sun-warmed pavement, the tires humming like a lullaby. Outside, the landscape unfolded into rolling fields and quiet woods, the kind of road where memories travel with you. Keanu kept his hands firm on the wheel, not gripping too tightly, just steady, just like Frank taught him. In the passenger seat, Frank Donovan sat wrapped in a thick flannel blanket. His shoulders had thinned, his body leaned more into the seat than it used to, but his presence still filled the cab. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. His breath came slow, measured. The window was cracked just slightly, and the wind caught the edge of Frank's white hair, as if the world itself was reaching to touch him one more time. Keanu had adjusted the rearview mirror earlier, not for traffic, but so he could see Frank without turning his head. But now, he didn't look. Not yet. Not while the road was open. Not while the sun still hung above them like it remembered who they were. It was a worn leather photo tucked in Frank's weathered hand. Keanu recognized it instantly. It was from the year he turned 17. Both of them grinning in the garage, faces smeared with grease. Frank's hand on his shoulder. It was a moment frozen in time, and somehow, Frank had kept it close all these years. "You ever wonder," Keanu said quietly, "if we'd have still found each other if the car hadn't broken down that day?" Frank didn't answer right away, but then his lips twitched, just slightly. "Fate finds you," he whispered, "even when the engine fails." Keanu smiled. "You always did have a way of making rust sound poetic." Frank let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh. His eyes stayed closed. His body didn't shift, but Keanu could feel him listening. They passed a field of golden wheat swaying like ocean waves. In the distance, an old gas station stood abandoned, its rusted sign creaking in the breeze. Keanu remembered stopping there once as a boy. Frank, teaching him how to check tire pressure, how to read a map, how to listen. "I used to think this road didn't lead anywhere," Keanu said. "And now?" Frank whispered, just barely. "Now I think it leads home." Frank didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The silence in the truck wasn't empty. It was full. Full of old echoes, shared miles, and everything that didn't need to be said aloud. Keanu glanced at the dashboard clock. They had been driving for nearly an hour now, winding through the quieter edges of Ontario, past the forests and farms that Frank used to point out when Keanu was little. In the distance, a pair of deer crossed the road slowly. Keanu eased off the gas, letting them pass without a rush. Frank used to call that respecting the rhythm of things. The sky had started to shift. The colors were warmer now, orange melting into soft purple at the edges. It reminded Keanu of every evening he'd ever spent under Frank's roof, when the day slowed down and the garage quieted. Frank would sip tea and let the world wind down beside him, never in a hurry to move, never asking more than what was offered. Keanu stole a glance at him again. Frank's eyes were closed, but his breathing was even. Peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't always come easy to men who've carried so much in silence. Then, as the truck dipped into a soft curve on the road, Frank stirred slightly. Not much, just enough to turn his head toward Keanu's side. "You did good, kid," he said. The words were faint, but clear enough to carry through the quiet. Keanu didn't answer at first. His throat tightened. He kept his gaze on the road, knowing if he turned too quickly, he'd fall apart. But he nodded, slowly, just once. "You too," he whispered. Frank let out one last soft exhale. Not heavy, not pained, just full. Like a sigh that had waited years to be released. Keanu knew. He didn't pull over, he didn't cry out, he just kept driving. The road ahead stretched toward the horizon, golden fields on either side, sky opening wider by the second. The wind brushed through the cracked window, playing gently with the corners of the notebook still tucked in his coat. Tears welled in Keanu's eyes, and this time, he didn't fight them. Frank wasn't gone. Not really. He was in every mile they traveled. Every lesson he taught, every turn of the wrench and every word he didn't say. Keanu finally pulled the truck over near a wide patch of grass overlooking a quiet lake. It was a place Frank used to bring him fishing. They hadn't caught much back then, but Frank always said the fish were just an excuse to sit still for a while. He turned off the engine. The stillness hit harder than the silence had. Frank was leaned back in the passenger seat, his face calm, his hand resting palm down on his lap. Keanu reached over and gently placed his own hand on top of it. No words, no theatrics, just contact. Skin to skin, memory. In the glove compartment, the leather notebook remained where Keanu had left it earlier. He reached in and pulled it out again, thumbing through the worn pages. Some of the ink was faded, but one line stood out on a yellowing page. "The road ends for all of us, but if you've driven it with grace, someone will keep going." He looked over at Frank once more. "You did that," Keanu whispered. "You kept me going." The air was starting to cool. Evening was arriving. Birds cawed in the trees around them, and the lake shimmered with soft ripples. Keanu thought about how many roads they'd driven together, literal and emotional, and how much of who he had become was shaped by this man sitting beside him. Frank hadn't needed titles, hadn't needed approval. He'd just shown up. Every time. Keanu stepped out of the truck and walked around to Frank's side. He opened the door carefully and stood there a moment, taking in the image. Frank, Donovan, slouched back in the seat like he was still watching the clouds roll by, like he had all the time in the world. Keanu didn't rush. He placed a hand on the truck roof and bowed his head. Then he reached down and touched the old dog tag that Frank always kept clipped to the mirror. It had never swung too far. It had stayed right there, balanced, just like Frank. He looked at the dashboard one more time, then to the horizon. The final drive hadn't been about the road. It had been about coming full circle. He took a deep breath, not to steady himself, but to honor the moment. Then he closed the door softly, like tucking someone in for a final rest. Frank Donovan had taken his last ride, and Keanu Reeves would carry the map from here. The sun hung low when Keanu stepped out of the truck and faced the garage again, this time without Frank. The silence was louder now. No soft country radio drifting from the cracked window. No cough. No gravel-voiced greeting. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, it was exactly as they'd left it, down to the coffee cup on the bench and the wrench still resting where Frank had last used it. But the warmth was missing. The presence. The quiet heartbeat of the space. Keanu stood in the center for a long time. Then he got to work. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He swept the floors, cleared the old coffee cup, dusted the counters. The place wasn't messy, but it felt paused, frozen in time. He unpacked a small box from the truck. Inside were a few items: a dimmable light bar, a pack of soft bulbs, a screwdriver, and a folded cloth. One by one, he installed the lights above the bench. Not too bright, just enough to glow like morning. He didn't want the place to feel renovated. He wanted it to feel remembered. Next, he placed a wooden plaque on the pegboard, right above the workbench where Frank had once taught him how to fix a brake pad. He ran his fingers over the inscription before securing it to the wall. Frank Donovan, builder of men. Keanu stepped back and looked at it. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink it away. It felt right. He took a slow walk around the shop, running his fingers over everything: tool drawers, the cracked stool, even the old air compressor that hadn't worked in 10 years. Every piece meant something. Every corner held a memory. The place hadn't just repaired engines. It had built lives. At the back of the shop, tucked in the same drawer where Frank kept his favorite wrench, Keanu gently placed the leather notebook. He hesitated, then added something to the last page. Just one sentence: "Thank you for staying." Then he closed the drawer and sat on the bench quietly, letting the hum of the new lights fill the silence Frank used to occupy. The next day, Keanu came back just after sunrise. The garage still held that warm scent of oil and sawdust, like a memory you could breathe in. He opened the front bay doors and let the light stretch across the concrete floor. He didn't expect company, but by mid-morning, the first knock came. It was a man in his 40s, carrying a small metal toolbox. "You don't know me," the man said, "but Frank let me change tires here when I was a kid. My mom was a single parent. I had nowhere to go after school. He gave me this." He lifted the old toolbox. "I became a mechanic because of him." Keanu invited him inside. The man looked around like he was stepping back into a childhood bedroom. He touched the wall gently. "Feels the same." By afternoon, a woman showed up with her teenage son. She introduced herself as Valerie. "I used to sweep the floors here every Saturday for pocket money. Frank taught me how to patch a tire." That was 25 years ago. Keanu listened, nodding. The stories began to build a rhythm. A retired firefighter who'd once learned how to change a belt here. A high school counselor who had been a teen runaway, taken in by Frank for an entire summer. A soft-spoken elderly man who said nothing at all, just placed a single, worn photo of Frank on the bench, gave Keanu a nod, and walked away. Word had spread. Keanu didn't post anything online. He didn't call anyone. The garage had simply lit up again, and people came. By the third day, someone had left flowers in a tin oil can. Another person dropped off a framed photo of Frank in front of the shop, taken sometime in the 80s. Keanu added a small table in the corner. On it sat the plaque again, now beside a folded American flag from Frank's military service. The photo album Patricia had brought was there too. People came and went, each leaving a story behind like a bolt turned loose and tightened again. The garage, Frank's garage, was living, not as a monument, but as a shared heartbeat of memory and meaning. That evening, as twilight fell and the last visitor left, Keanu stood alone once more beneath the soft lights he had installed. The glow wasn't harsh. It didn't spotlight anything. It simply existed. Quiet, warm, like Frank himself. He reached for the drawer beneath the old workbench and gently opened it. The notebook was still there, just as he'd left it. But now, someone had added a small folded note on top. Keanu opened it. It was handwritten in a shaky scrawl. It said, "You brought him home. Thank you." There was no name, no return address. But Keanu didn't need one. He recognized Patricia's writing. It was her quiet blessing, her final tribute to the man who'd held them all together without asking to be held himself. Keanu placed the note back inside, closed the drawer slowly, and rested both hands on the bench. He could hear faint echoes, his own laughter as a boy, the clang of tools, Frank's calm voice reminding him that real strength is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It wasn't just a goodbye anymore. It was a legacy returned to its roots. Keanu took one last walk around the shop, running his fingers along the edges of the tool racks, the dented lockers, the wooden stool in the corner that still wobbled the same way it had when he was 13. He reached the garage door and looked back. In that golden hush, with the scent of the past still lingering in the air, Keanu whispered a final promise. "I'll keep it running, Frank." Then he switched off the lights, one by one, until only the glow above the plaque remained. A gentle reminder for anyone who passed by or stopped in. Frank Donovan, builder of men. Outside, the evening air had cooled, but Keanu didn't rush to leave. He sat on the porch of the house beside the garage for a while, just breathing, just being. Somewhere inside him, a weight had shifted. He hadn't come to say goodbye. He had come to remember. And in remembering, he had brought Frank's story full circle. The kind of ending that doesn't close a door, it opens it. It started with a blank page, a cursor blinking, steady and slow, like the rhythm of an old heart still echoing in his ears. Keanu sat alone at his desk, the notebook from the glove box open beside him, Frank's handwriting faded but present. A cup of black coffee sat untouched. Then he typed the first words. "My father never raised his voice, but he raised a life." He paused. That sentence didn't need fixing. The rest came like waves, not of sorrow, but of clarity. He wrote about a man who wasn't bound to him by blood, but by a greater thread, constancy. A man who didn't wear uniforms or medals in public, but who held his family together with grease-stained hands and wisdom spoken in action. He never needed to be called Dad, Keanu typed, because every Saturday in that garage, every sandwich packed quietly, every ride home without questions, he was earning it. He told stories of the garage, the way Frank taught him how to sand rust instead of scrape it, the way he taught him that strength wasn't volume, it was follow-through. He wrote not just for himself, but for everyone who ever had a mentor, a steady hand, a quiet protector in the background. And when he signed it, he wrote not as an actor, not as Keanu Reeves' public figure, just as Keanu, the boy. Frank taught to hold a wrench, and to hold steady. He hit send. Within hours, the letter was shared thousands of times. Headlines quoted it, blogs reposted it. But the real stories, started coming in the comments. A firefighter wrote, "My uncle raised me when my parents died. He never asked for thanks, just told me to keep showing up. This letter made me cry." A woman posted, "I was about to throw away my grandfather's old tools. After reading this, I'm keeping them. And I'm learning how to use them." Keanu scrolled, quietly. He didn't reply to every comment, but he read them all. Because every message reminded him, Frank's love hadn't ended. It had just changed hands. The next day, Keanu's publicist called. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's not just going viral, it's connecting with people." But Keanu wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for resonance, and it had found its way. Letters began arriving at the studio. Not emails, handwritten letters, the kind Frank would have respected. One envelope came from a man in rural Alberta. Inside was a photo of a tractor and a folded piece of paper that read, "My father never hugged me, but he never missed a single storm. He patched roofs in the rain and never complained. Thank you for reminding me who he was." Another came from a teenager in Detroit. "I never met my dad, but there's a janitor at my school who taught me how to fix my bike. I'm giving him a copy of your letter. I think he's my Frank." The stories multiplied. Posts appeared with the hashtag #MyFrank. People shared photos of mentors, teachers, stepfathers, uncles, coaches, men and women who had shown up, quietly, again and again. One user wrote, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear work boots and carry lunch in the same box every day for 30 years. Keanu stayed quiet online. He didn't need to speak further. The story had legs of its own now. He returned to the garage a few days later. Someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers on the bench with a note tucked underneath. "To Frank Donovan, you never met me, but I know you. Thank you for loving him the way you did." Keanu stood there for a long time, holding that piece of paper, the smell of oil and wood lingering in the air. The garage had become something else now, not just a place for fixing engines, but for remembering the people who fixed lives. He whispered aloud, "You were never just mine." Then, almost without thinking, he reached for the plaque on the wall and added a second line beneath Frank's name. "Builder of men, father of many." As he stepped outside, the sky opened slightly, letting a single ray of sunlight break through the gray clouds, and Keanu smiled. He didn't need applause, just the feeling that Frank, somewhere, was nodding. That night, Keanu sat on the edge of his hotel bed, holding the last copy of the letter he'd written. The original had been handwritten, just like the note Frank sent him. He folded it once more and tucked it inside a leather-bound journal he'd started keeping. On the inside cover, he wrote a new dedication. "For anyone who ever stayed quietly, faithfully, and without asking for thanks." He thought about how Frank never cared for recognition. He used to say, "If you need a medal to do good, you're doing it for the wrong reason." And yet this quiet man had managed to stir a nation into gratitude, not by doing anything extraordinary, but by being steady, by showing up. A knock came at the door. It was Patricia, carrying an old shoebox. "I thought you might want this," she said softly. Inside were dozens of small items. A crumpled Polaroid of Keanu at age 7 with grease on his nose, a postcard Keanu sent from his first set, a newspaper clipping of Frank's name buried in the community service section. At the very bottom was a wrinkled sticky note. Frank's handwriting, clear as ever. "Don't forget to check the oil and say thank you." Keanu laughed through his tears. He never changed. "No," Patricia said, smiling, "but he changed us." Later, as Keanu walked outside into the night, he looked up at the sky. He imagined Frank somewhere out there, quiet, content, watching. And in that moment, Keanu knew something important. You don't need to be remembered by the world to be unforgettable. You just need to matter to one person, deeply, honestly. Frank had mattered, and now, through the voices rising in his honor, he would continue to matter. The garage was no longer just a structure. It was a movement, and in towns across the world, sons and daughters were writing their own letters, saying thank you, naming their Franks. One by one, hearts opened, and in the stillness of the night, Keanu whispered the final line of his letter aloud. My father never raised his voice, but he raised a life. Then he walked back inside, quietly, the way Frank would have liked. The morning of the ride came without fanfare, just a quiet sky, pale and open, and the low rustle of wind brushing across the pavement. Keanu stood in the driveway of the house he had grown up in, holding a folded cloth close to his chest. Inside was Frank's old wrench, his most trusted tool, wrapped in time and memory. The grip was still bound in faded red tape, worn smooth from decades of use. Keanu stared at it for a long moment before placing it gently on the passenger seat of Frank's restored Chevy pickup. He didn't say anything. There were no words that morning, just the steady breath of the wind and the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. He started the truck. The engine roared softly, that familiar purr of a machine that had served more than one lifetime. It didn't need to be perfect. Frank never cared about polish. Let it run honest, he used to say. Without announcement, people started arriving. The invitation hadn't gone public, just a few quiet phone calls, a handful of texts sent late at night, and a whisper shared from neighbor to neighbor. By mid-morning, the street was lined with cars, some pristine, others patched with rust and pride. Vintage motorcycles, work trucks, old classics, nothing flashy, all real. Each vehicle held someone Frank had helped, former students, fellow mechanics. One man had driven 5 hours in a 1984 Mustang with duct tape holding the mirror on. Another arrived on a beat-up scooter Frank once helped him rebuild as a teen. Every single person came not to mourn, but to remember. Keanu walked among them, nodding, silent. They didn't expect speeches. No one brought flowers. Instead, they brought presents. That was the only tribute Frank would have accepted. As the engines warmed, Keanu climbed back into the Chevy. He adjusted the rearview mirror and glanced down at the wrench beside him. "You ready?" he whispered. The caravan moved slowly down the street, a line of motors, steady and humble, rolling like a stream through the town. They passed the old garage. The new sign read, Donovan's Garage, Builder of Men. Lights glowed above the entrance, even though it was daytime, a quiet symbol of what remained. Along the way, neighbors stepped outside. Some saluted, others placed their hands over their hearts. One child stood barefoot, holding a cardboard sign. He fixed my bike. Keanu swallowed hard and kept driving. The line of vehicles stretched nearly a mile as they crossed through the center of town. No one honked, no one blasted music. Only the low rumble of engines filled the streets, an unspoken rhythm that felt more sacred than silence. Shopkeepers paused at their doors. A mailman stood by his open truck, hand over his heart. A woman outside the laundromat wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. As they drove past the local high school, a janitor, gray-haired, stooped, stepped forward holding up a wrench in the air. Keanu remembered him, Mr. Billings. Frank had helped him fix his car one night after a PTA meeting when no one else stayed late. That wrench was more than metal, it was memory. The convoy turned onto a rural road that twisted out of town, the pavement narrowing until it opened up into a wide overlook that Frank used to love. It wasn't grand, just honest. Open sky, fields, and the faint shimmer of a river in the distance. Keanu brought the truck to a stop, parking at the head of the circle forming along the edge. Everyone cut their engines. Stillness fell like a blanket. Keanu stepped out and reached across the seat for the wrench. He walked slowly to the front of the Chevy, where a simple wooden table had been set up the night before. On it sat a weathered piece of cloth embroidered with one phrase in bold stitching, "Leave it better than you found it." Keanu placed the wrench down with reverence. It wasn't ceremony, it was respect. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing. His hands gripped the edge of the table, the wind tugging at his coat. Around him, no one moved, not even the kids. It was like the whole town understood that this wasn't just about Frank. It was about every man who ever showed up, every mentor who didn't ask to be remembered, every act of quiet strength that built another person's foundation. Finally, Keanu stepped back. He turned to face the crowd, and though no words had been planned, something in him rose. He didn't speak loud. He didn't need to. "Thank you," he said, voice tight, gaze on the horizon. "For the road." There was no applause, only nods. One man clapped a hand to his chest. A woman held her child a little closer. In that moment, every person there knew exactly what had been given and what had been lost. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the clouds in streaks of gold and amber, Keanu turned back toward the truck. He ran his hand gently along the front fender. The paint faded, a few spots rusted, but still intact, still strong. Just like Frank had always been. One by one, the other drivers began stepping out. No one rushed. They walked with intention, as if stepping into a place of reverence. A teenager with oil-streaked hands approached the table, placed a small spark plug beside the wrench, then nodded and walked away. A woman in her 40s set down a photo of a younger version of herself beside a beat-up go-kart. The note beneath it read, "He helped me finish it. I drove it like a champion." Keanu stood quietly, watching the offerings build. A socket wrench, a tattered bandana, a folded note that simply read, "Thanks for keeping me off the street." Patricia arrived last, escorted gently by a neighbor. She wore a simple black coat and held a small bouquet of marigolds, Frank's favorite. She laid them on the table beside the wrench, her hand trembling only slightly. Then she turned to Keanu, her eyes filled with the kind of grief that comes only after a life fully loved and now fully missed. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Keanu reached for her hand and squeezed it. Together, they looked out at the line of cars, the quiet crowd, the tools and mementos left behind by lives Frank had touched. The moment held. Then Keanu stepped forward one final time and gently closed the cloth over the wrench and items, folding the corners in like a sacred bundle. He turned to the crowd. If you were ever shaped by his hands, keep building. If you were ever calmed by his voice, speak with kindness. And if he ever fixed something for you, fix something for someone else. A few nods, a few tears. Then one by one, the engine started up again. No revving, just a slow, rolling departure. Each person taking something invisible with them, something that could not be framed or mounted, but lived instead in how they'd treat the world tomorrow. Keanu stood until the last vehicle pulled away, then turned back to the truck. He climbed in, placed his hand on the steering wheel Frank had once gripped, and whispered, "We made it, old man." And then he drove off, alone, but never more full. The air near the garage smelled faintly of oil and old cedar, the kind of scent that never quite fades no matter how many years pass. Keanu stood in the same gravel lot where Frank had once taught him how to back in a car without jerking the wheel. This time, though, he wasn't here to drive. He was here to sit, to remember. A small wooden bench had just been installed beside the old hand-painted sign, Donovan's Garage, open doors, open hearts. It faced the street just like Frank used to when he'd sip coffee and wave at neighbors on their way to work. The bench wasn't ornate, no fancy carvings, just smooth, sturdy wood with a small brass plate screwed into the top rail. It read, "In memory of Frank Donovan." He opened the door, and the rest of us walked through. Keanu brushed his hand across the surface, then sat down. It creaked slightly under his weight, just like Frank's recliner used to. For a long while, he didn't do anything. Didn't check his phone, didn't think about Hollywood scripts or meetings. He just watched. Watched the way a teenager across the street helped an elderly man pick up spilled groceries. Watched the way a little boy pointed at the garage sign and asked his dad, "Was this a castle?" And his dad smiled and said, "Kind of. A place where people were built." Every so often, someone would approach Keanu, a mechanic from the neighborhood, a young woman whose father once learned under Frank, a teacher, a retired police officer. They didn't ask for autographs. They sat next to him, sometimes said a sentence or two, sometimes nothing. Just silence. Frank's kind of silence. On Tuesdays, Patricia would join him. She'd brought a thermos of coffee and 2 paper cups. She'd sit, knees close to his, and tell stories about the time Frank taught Keanu how to jumpstart a car with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. They'd laugh. Sometimes they'd cry. But mostly, they just sat. One afternoon, a group of teens walked by after school. One of them, a lanky boy with oil-stained jeans, stopped and looked at the sign. "Was this your dad's place?" he asked. Keanu paused, then nodded. "It wasn't mine by blood," Keanu said quietly, "but he gave me everything that mattered." The boy nodded slowly, then asked, "You think I could learn here?" Keanu looked at him and smiled. The next week, Keanu brought a box of old tools and set them on a folding table just inside the garage. The teen showed up again, this time with 2 friends. They didn't say much at first, just circled the tools like they were relics. Keanu picked up a wrench and held it out. "This one's got a story," he said. "Frank once used it to fix a truck in the middle of a thunderstorm, said tools don't care about weather, just purpose." The kids smiled, unsure if they were supposed to laugh. But Keanu wasn't trying to be funny. He was trying to pass something on. Not just technique, not just torque, but a way of being in the world. Steady, honest, quietly strong. He taught them how to check tire pressure, how to sand down a rusted bolt, how to listen for an engine's rhythm. But in between the lessons were moments Frank would have loved. A question about life, a story about failure, a silence that didn't need to be filled. One afternoon, Keanu sat on the bench again, sweat on his brow, grease on his hands. Patricia walked up with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She handed him one, then sat beside him. "Looks like the place has found its heartbeat again," she said, looking at the teens joking inside the garage. "It never really stopped," Keanu said. "It was just waiting." They sat in silence for a while. Then Patricia pulled out a small envelope from her purse and handed it to him. "I found this taped to the back of Frank's tool cabinet. It's addressed to you." Keanu opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, the kind Frank always used. His handwriting was shaky but familiar. "Kid, if you're reading this, you stayed. That's all I ever hoped for. Teach what you know, fix what you can, and when you don't know what to do, sit still. Let the silence tell you. Proud of you. Always." Keanu folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he stood and looked at the garage, the bench, the teens, the sun cutting through the rafters like light through stained glass. He turned to Patricia. "I think it's time we made this official," he said. "No more ghosts. Let's make this a place for the living." She nodded, her eyes misty but proud. And just like that, the garage began again. The next weekend, Keanu brought out a small wooden sign he had commissioned. He installed it right beneath the original Donovan's Garage, Open Doors, Open Hearts plaque. The new sign read, "Legacy Bench, sit, remember, pass it on." He didn't call the news, no ceremony, just quiet work. A few neighbors walked by, offering nods and small waves. Some stopped to ask about the bench. Others sat for a moment, as if drawn to something deeper than wood and metal. One elderly man placed a hand on the bench and whispered, "Frank gave me my first job." Then he turned and walked away. A woman in her 30s arrived with a box of cookies. "My brother used to come here after school. Said Mr. Donovan was the first adult who listened." A boy, no older than 10, sat beside Keanu and watched the clouds. "My dad says this place was like church," he said softly. Keanu looked at the boy and smiled. "It still is." Later that day, Keanu sat alone as the sky shifted to evening. The neighborhood quieted. Leaves rustled. From inside the garage came the soft sound of a socket wrench being turned by one of the teens. Steady, patient. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush past. A car slowed as it passed the driveway. The driver waved, one of Frank's old customers. No words were exchanged, just that one gesture. Respect, memory, gratitude. Patricia arrived near sunset with a thermos of tea. She sat down beside him again, just like before. "You know," she said, pouring them both a cup, "he never built this place for recognition." Keanu nodded. "I know. But he built it to last." Keanu looked out at the horizon. "He built it to hold people together." And it still does. They sipped their tea. As the sun dipped behind the trees, it cast golden light across the bench and the sign above it, a soft, almost sacred glow. Patricia reached out and placed her hand gently over Keanu's. "Proud," she said. "Already was," Keanu whispered. He just never said it out loud. They didn't need to talk after that. The garage behind them stood as it always had. Weathered but strong, with its heart beating in every kid it shaped, every soul it held, and every person who found a place to sit and remember. The morning air was cool, the kind that whispered instead of roared. Keanu stood at the edge of the garage driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the bench beneath the sign. The old wrench sat right where he'd left it, beside it the notebook. Its leather worn, its pages full of memories, not maintenance logs. He took a few steps forward, pausing to rest his hand on the garage's wooden frame. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but a soft glow crept across the pavement, touching the edges of the bench, spilling into the open doorway like an old friend returning. He stepped inside. The scent of oil and dust still lingered, but now it carried peace instead of pain. He ran his fingers along the workbench. It felt the same as it did when he was 13, pretending to be stronger than he was. Frank had seen through it, every time. But he never called it out. He just handed Keanu a wrench and showed him how to hold steady. A quote from the notebook returned to his mind. "Some men raise their voice, others raise you." Keanu closed his eyes, letting those words echo for a moment. Back outside, a soft breeze moved the leaves above the garage roof. Patricia's old rocking chair swayed slightly on the porch. Empty now, but not lonely. He looked toward the street, quiet and still. Then, his gaze returned to the bench. He walked toward it slowly, as if every step pulled something up from deep within him. With care, he sat down. The wrench clinked gently as he set his hand beside it. A soft voice played in his mind. Frank's voice. "Don't waste time on polish when the engine's what matters." Keanu chuckled under his breath. He looked forward now, straight ahead at the road Frank had once driven him down. Over and over, never asking for thanks, never needing the wheel to feel in control. He simply showed up, day after day, mile after mile. Keanu cleared his throat, the weight of emotion behind his voice. "Thank you, Frank," he said softly, "for every mile, for every moment." The breeze shifted slightly, as if the world itself had heard. He turned to the camera. His voice was clear, but there was something softer in his eyes. Not sadness, not even grief. Something deeper. Some stories don't need a spotlight. Some lives don't make headlines. But if they shaped your path, if they held you up when the world tried to break you, then they matter. More than we'll ever be able to say. He paused. Frank Donovan was never on magazine covers. He never walked red carpets. But he built something with his hands. And more importantly, he built someone with his heart. Another pause. "I wouldn't be here if not for him." The camera slowly pulled back, giving space to the moment. "If this story moved you," Keanu continued, his voice steady, "like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but because someone out there might be sitting in silence, wondering if they made a difference." He looked down at the wrench, then gently picked it up and turned it in his hand. "And maybe," he added, "just maybe, it's time to call the one who never asked for credit, but gave you everything." He placed the wrench back beside the notebook. The shot widened. The garage behind him, the sign above him, and the man on the bench. Still, thoughtful, present. The wind moved slightly through the trees. Fade to black. And on the screen, in quiet white letters, Frank Donovan, builder of men. The final image lingered. A wrench, a notebook, and a legacy too big for any garage to hold.